Bacteria thrived in wounds created by the powders. Women who believed themselves refined carried ulcers and fevers that made their lives miserable. The methods of application only added to the harm. Some powders were blown through narrow tubes, sending clouds of toxic dust into the air. Servants often handled this task for wealthier women, shaking bottles or pressing powder puffs against skin. The servants inhaled the particles as well, damaging their lungs and burning their own hands. No one thought to protect them. They were considered replaceable, just another part of the household routine. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like covering the body each morning with household bleach and calling it perfume. Once a routine began, it was difficult to stop. Women feared that abandoning the powders would mark them as careless or dirty. Respectability was tied to fragrance, and fragrance was tied to powders. To stop was to risk shame. Even those who suspected the powders harmed them continued using them, trapped by expectation. Doctors occasionally mentioned dangers in medical journals. A few wrote that mercury and phosphorus should not be used in cosmetics. But warnings were small, scattered, and easy to ignore. Manufacturers continued without restriction. Without laws to enforce safety, the market was flooded with dangerous products. Women bought them without question, trusting labels more than rare warnings. The repeated miscarriages were devastating but normalized. When pregnancies ended suddenly, women blamed themselves. Husbands sometimes accused them of weakness, or neighbors suggested divine punishment. Grief was carried in silence. The real cause, dusted daily onto the body, was invisible to everyone. I feel a deep unease imagining women carefully applying these powders each night, unaware that they were quietly destroying the children they longed to bring into the world. Wealth made little difference. Rich women purchased powders in elegant bottles imported from Europe. Poorer women bought cheaper versions wrapped in plain paper. Both groups suffered the same burns, infections, and miscarriages. The packaging looked different, but the contents were equally destructive. Respectability demanded the same routine across classes, and women paid the price equally. The suffering was hidden within households. Servants noticed sores while helping their mistresses dress, but said nothing. Husbands saw their wives weaken after miscarriages, but looked away. Children grew up with mothers who carried scars and illnesses from powders, but they were too young to understand. The silence ensured that the cycle continued. Even when women realized that powders caused them harm, they believed there was no alternative. Water was forbidden during menstruation. Clothes were reused until they stiffened with stains. The smell of blood or infection was considered shameful, worse than any pain powders caused. So they chose to endure burns and miscarriages rather than risk humiliation. The persistence of this practice reveals how powerfully appearances rule daily life. Women were not free to care for their bodies safely. They were trapped between superstition, social expectation, and toxic products sold under the name of refinement. Every puff of powder pressed the illusion of cleanliness deeper into their skin, while stripping health away from within. Regulation came late. Only after decades of reports and scandals did officials begin to restrict ingredients in cosmetics. By then, generations of women had already paid with their health and their children. The damage could not be undone. The silence had lasted too long. Powders promised beauty, but delivered scars. They promised freshness, but carried death. They turned natural life into a hidden tragedy, leaving women grieving silently behind the mask of fragrance. The illusion of refinement held enormous power. A woman who smelled of violets was admired. A woman who smelled of blood was shamed. Between those two choices, powders seemed necessary. Yet what looked like dignity was in fact destruction. Perfumed powders covered odours, but they could not hide the suffering, the burns, the lost pregnancies, and the endless silence left marks deeper than any fragrance could erase. Every sprinkle of powder was another step closer to harm. What seemed to keep women respectable actually made them vulnerable. What was sold as care was really cruelty. and in the shadows of their wardrobes, the very clothes they wore would reveal another layer of filth and decay waiting to spread further harm. Powders were sold everywhere, in small tins with polished lids or glass bottles decorated with floral labels. They promised freshness, refinement, and a way to manage the body in silence. For women who had no access to safe hygiene practices, powders seemed like a gift. They were shaken into garments, pressed directly onto the skin, and even dusted into the most private areas of the body. A gesture that looked gentle on the surface was, in fact, a way of spreading poison. Manufacturers made these powders from whatever ingredients were cheap and easy to obtain. Mercury compounds and white phosphorus were common. They gave a pale sheen, created a dry texture, and carried strong odours to mask anything unpleasant. These chemicals also burned the skin and damaged internal organs. Women applied them faithfully, believing they were meeting the expectations of society, while in reality, they were harming themselves each time. It is grimly absurd to think that a woman could lose her health simply by trying to smell acceptable. The first effect was irritation. As soon as powders touched sensitive tissue, women felt stinging. Skin turned red, peeled, and sometimes bled, over weeks and months. Repeated use created sores that did not heal. Women carried these wounds while continuing their housework, childcare, and daily labour. They said nothing, because to admit the pain meant drawing attention to matters considered shameful. The long-term effects were even more devastating. White phosphorus interfered with the reproductive system. Women who used powders frequently experienced miscarriages, sometimes losing pregnancies again and again. Families blamed them for weakness. Husbands distanced themselves. Neighbours whispered, and mothers told daughters that such losses were natural. No one pointed to the powders as the cause. The connection remained unspoken, hidden by the silence that surrounded women's bodies. Perfume was the mask. Powders came in scents of violets, roses, or citrus. They were designed to cover the strong smells of unwashed cloth and menstrual rags. For a brief moment, the fragrance worked, but under the surface, infection grew. Bacteria thrived in wounds created by the powders. Women who believed themselves refined carried ulcers and fevers that made their lives miserable. The methods of application only added to the harm. Some powders were blown through narrow tubes, sending clouds of toxic dust into the air. Servants often handled this task for wealthier women, shaking bottles or pressing powder puffs against skin. The servants inhaled the particles as well, damaging their lungs and burning their own hands. No one thought to protect them. They were considered replaceable, just another part of the household routine. If we compare this to modern life, it would be like covering the body each morning with household bleach and calling it perfume. Once a routine began, it was difficult to stop. Women feared that abandoning the powders would mark them as careless or dirty. Respectability was tied to fragrance, and fragrance was tied to powders. To stop was to risk shame. Even those who suspected the powders harmed them continued using them, trapped by expectation. Doctors occasionally mentioned dangers in medical journals. A few wrote that mercury and phosphorus should not be used in cosmetics. But warnings were small, scattered, and easy to ignore. Manufacturers continued without restriction. Without laws to enforce safety, the market was flooded with dangerous products. Women bought them without question, trusting labels more than rare warnings. The repeated miscarriages were devastating but normalized. When pregnancies ended suddenly, women blamed themselves. Husbands sometimes accused them of weakness, or neighbours suggested divine punishment. Grief was carried in silence. The real cause, dusted daily onto the body, was invisible to everyone. I feel a deep unease imagining women carefully applying these powders each night, unaware that they were quietly destroying the children they longed to bring into the world. Wealth made little difference. Rich women purchased powders in elegant bottles imported from Europe. Poorer women bought cheaper versions wrapped in plain paper. Both groups suffered the same burns, infections, and miscarriages. The packaging looked different, but the contents were equally destructive. Respectability demanded the same routine across classes, and women paid the price equally. The suffering was hidden within households. Servants noticed sores while helping their mistresses dress, but said nothing. Husbands saw their wives weaken after miscarriages, but looked away. Children grew up with mothers who carried scars and illnesses from powders, but they were too young to understand. The silence ensured that the cycle continued. Even when women realized that powders caused them harm, they believed there was no alternative. Water was forbidden during menstruation. Clothes were reused until they stiffened with stains. The smell of blood or infection was considered shameful, worse than any pain powders caused, so they chose to endure burns and miscarriages rather than risk humiliation. The persistence of this practice reveals how powerfully appearances ruled daily life. Women were not free to care for their bodies safely. They were trapped between superstition, social expectation, and toxic products sold under the name of refinement. Every puff of powder pressed the illusion of cleanliness deeper into their skin, while stripping health away from within. Regulation came late. Only after decades of reports and scandals did officials begin to restrict ingredients in cosmetics. By then, generations of women had already paid with their health and their children. The damage could not be undone. The silence had lasted too long. Powders promised beauty, but delivered scars. They promised freshness, but carried death. They turned natural life into a hidden tragedy, leaving women grieving silently behind the mask of fragrance. The illusion of refinement held enormous power. A woman who smelled of violets was admired. A woman who smelled of blood was shamed. Between those two choices, powders seemed necessary. Yet what looked like dignity was in fact destruction. Perfumed powders covered odours, but they could not hide the suffering, the burns, the lost pregnancies, and the endless silence left marks deeper than any fragrance could erase. Every sprinkle of powder was another step closer to harm. What seemed to keep women respectable actually made them vulnerable. What was sold as care was really cruelty, and in the shadows of their wardrobes, the very clothes they wore would reveal another layer of filth and decay waiting to spread further harm. Hands were the tools of survival, and women relied on them for every task. Cooking, cleaning, gardening, caring for children, and handling rags during menstruation were all done without gloves. Fingernails, never trimmed short, became the hidden record of these tasks. Dirt pressed into the edges, waste clung to the underside, and layers of grease hardened into permanent stains. Women believed that long nails signified refinement, but the reality was that their nails held more filth than most surfaces in their homes. The superstition surrounding long nails made matters worse. Families told daughters that trimming nails too short was improper, even masculine. Long nails were associated with delicacy and beauty. This meant that dirt and waste accumulated with no effort to remove them. The longer the nails, the more filth they carried. Underneath, parasites found a safe place to grow. Worms, fungi, and bacteria lived in the warm, dark spaces. Infection spreads easily from hand to mouth or from hand to food. It is almost unbelievable that something praised as a symbol of femininity doubled as a breeding ground for parasites. Cooking with bare hands ensured contamination. Women prepared bread with fingers coated in soil from the garden. They chopped vegetables with nails that scraped against raw meat. Flies gathered quickly, feeding on both the food and the hands that touched it. Families ate meals flavoured not just by ingredients but by the invisible presence of waste. Stomach illness was common, and diarrhea killed children, yet few ever made the connection between disease and the nails that stirred the pot. Laundry offered no escape. Washing was often done in cold water without soap, and clothes were washed by hand. Menstrual cloths were rinsed the same way. Blood clung to nails. drying into dark crusts that were difficult to remove. Over time, nails grew permanently discoloured, stained in shades of brown and black. No amount of rubbing could restore their natural colour. Women carried the marks of their labour on their hands, though society pretended not to notice. Gardening added another layer of filth, soil, manure, and waste are spread across the fields each day. Nails filled with tiny grains of dirt and worm eggs clung to the surface. Without washing, these eggs travelled into food or onto the skin of children. Intestinal infections spread silently through households. Families accepted the weakness and pain as fate. No one considered the soil hidden beneath nails as the culprit. If we compare this to today, it would be like feeding your family after scooping waste with your bare hands, but treating it as perfectly ordinary. The smell from the hands was noticeable. Nails carried not only dirt but odours of everything they touched. Fish, blood, manure, and sweat all mingled together. The scent lingered, following women as they worked, ate, and cared for children. It clung to fabrics and spread to food, yet it was ignored. To acknowledge it was to break the silence about the realities of daily life. Some women attempted to mask the filth with powders or perfumes. They dusted their hands with scented powders, believing fragrance was enough. The dirt remained underneath, hidden but alive. Worms and fungi thrived despite the smell of violets. The illusion of cleanliness was stronger than the truth. Families praised the appearance of refinement, never realizing that disease was spreading silently from hand to mouth. Children often suffered the worst. They ate food prepared by dirty hands and were cared for by mothers whose nails carried infection. Infants were especially vulnerable, touched constantly by fingers that had just handled waste or soil. Fevers came quickly, sometimes ending in death, yet no one questioned the cause. Families accepted illness as destiny, while continuing the same habits that spread it. The nails themselves became painful over time. Dirt pushed under the nail beds, creating pressure and infection. Swelling caused nails to thicken and crack. Some women developed fungal infections that turned nails brittle and foul-smelling. The sight was common, but it was never openly discussed. Women hid their hands when possible, covering them with fabric or folding them into their laps. Respectability demanded silence even as pain grew worse. Wealthier women were not exempt. They too avoided cutting nails, believing long fingers looked elegant. Servants prepared their meals, but the servants themselves worked with nails just as dirty. Food carried the same risks, whether served on silver platters or wooden boards. Disease crossed class lines easily. No one was safe from what lay beneath nails. Doctors noticed infections but rarely traced them back to hands. They treated symptoms with tonics or poultices, never addressing the source. The idea that nails could harbour disease was not widely understood. Without guidance, women continued their routines, spreading illness with each touch. The persistence of this problem reflects the silence surrounding hygiene. Women were expected to appear proper but were denied the means to stay clean. Long nails symbolised femininity, while soap and scissors were neglected. The contradiction defined their lives. Beauty was measured by something that carried danger. Families suffered together, but women carried the blame. When illness spread, they were accused of neglect, even though they followed customs faithfully. They endured the shame quietly, never realizing that the very expectations placed upon them were the source of harm. I feel a deep discomfort imagining women accused of failure while they lived by rules that made cleanliness impossible. Over time, nails grew thicker with layers of filth, turning permanently dark. They told the story of labour, silence, and disease. Each mark was a reminder of the work done by hands that never rested. Yet society saw only whether nails were long enough to prove refinement. Health was ignored, and dignity was measured in dangerous ways. The story of nails reveals another layer of hidden danger in daily life. Women's bodies bore the evidence of poverty and labour, but customs turned it into symbols of grace. The truth lived under their fingertips, in dirt, waste, and disease that spread silently from family to family. What was admired as feminine was, in reality, destructive. What was praised as proper was, in truth, filthy. And what was demanded by society ensured that women carried disease at their very fingertips. Fingernails were not just a decoration. They were reservoirs of sickness, spreading harm through every touch. The silence around them allowed the problem to grow, leaving families vulnerable to illnesses they could not explain. The darkness beneath nails carried more than dirt. It carried the secrets of disease, hidden in plain sight, and while hands touched food and fabric each day, wardrobes themselves were becoming the next hiding place for rot and creatures no one dared to confront. Laundry was a task every woman faced, but how it was done revealed a world of neglect and superstition. Sunlight, which could have dried and purified fabric, was considered an enemy of beauty. Women believed that direct sunlight would darken cloth and ruin the appearance of their garments. To protect fabric, they dried clothes indoors, usually near smoky fireplaces or inside kitchens. The decision turned laundry from an act of cleaning into one of contamination. Clothes came out of the wash damp and were carried straight into environments filled with soot, grease, and mould. The bunched fabric absorbed every smell of the household: smoke from cooking fires, sweat from workers returning home, and the damp of poorly ventilated rooms all mingled together. The odour became a permanent feature of garments, one that could not be removed with the simple rinses women performed. When worn, the smell clung to skin, hair, and bedding. It announced itself in every social gathering, though politeness prevented anyone from mentioning it. It is oddly comical to think of women protecting the colour of their clothes while ignoring the stench that followed them everywhere. Underwear faced even worse conditions. Instead of hanging in fresh air, some women stored or dried their garments on chicken coops. Chickens picked at the fabric, pulling loose threads and removing lice or fleas clinging to the fibres. The practice was accepted as practical, even clever, but it left undergarments smeared with droppings and alive with new parasites. When worn again, the fabric scratched against skin, carrying both stains and insects. Moisture that lingered in poorly dried clothes created the perfect breeding ground for mould. Women dressed themselves daily in garments damp at the seams or shoulders. Mould grew silently, producing spores that irritated skin and lungs. Rashes and coughing became common, but no one connected them to clothing. The garments looked clean enough, and appearances mattered more than health. The absence of sunlight also allowed lice and fleas to survive unnoticed. Heat and light might have killed them, but darkness gave them protection. Clothing stored indoors or dried in corners of kitchens often carried live parasites into trunks and drawers. Women who thought they were wearing fresh garments were, in truth, wrapping themselves in fabric already infested. If we compare this to today, it would be like washing your clothes carefully and then hanging them to dry inside a smoky garage filled with animals. The smell of smoke was strongest in winter. Fireplaces burned constantly, filling rooms with soot. Clothes dried beside them turned grey and stiff. Women wore dresses and undergarments that smelled permanently of ash. The odour clung even after perfumes were applied, mixing with body odour into a sour, choking stench. Yet these garments were still considered clean. To suggest otherwise was seen as rude or ungrateful. Children carried the same burdens. Their small garments were dried in the same kitchens, absorbing the same filth. Babies wore shirts that smelled of mould and smoke, pressed against their delicate skin. Illnesses of the lungs spread quickly, often blamed on cold air or bad luck. The truth, damp clothes teeming with spores, was ignored. Families carried on as though nothing was wrong. Wealthier households with larger spaces might have had separate laundry rooms, but superstition still kept clothes from the sun. Indoor drying racks were preferred to outdoor lines. The idea of clothing bleaching under sunlight was treated as ruin. even though it might have spared them from mould and parasites. Respectability depended on appearances, and colour was considered more important than cleanliness. Servants bore the brunt of the labour. They hauled wet clothes, hung them in smoky kitchens, and endured the same odours when they dressed in hand-me-downs. Their hands cracked from cold water and soap, yet the garments they produced were never truly clean. They were held responsible for stains and smells, even though the methods demanded by their mistresses guaranteed failure. I find it disheartening to imagine women spending hours on laundry, only to put their families back into clothes that carry illness with every thread. When clothes were finally stored, they were folded into trunks or drawers that were rarely aired. Damp fabric sealed inside wooden boxes turned musty within days. By the time the garments were worn again, they smelled stronger than before. Women tried to cover the odours with sachets of lavender or rose petals, but the scents only mixed, creating an even stranger fragrance. Illnesses related to these practices spread quietly. Skin infections, fungal growth, and lung irritation followed the use of damp or mouldy garments. Fevers were explained away as chance, while rashes were dismissed as minor. No one pointed to the wardrobes themselves as the source of sickness. The cycle repeated endlessly, sustained by superstition and silence. Magazines occasionally offered advice, but it rarely challenged tradition. Articles emphasized folding clothes neatly and keeping them perfumed. Few recommended airing garments outdoors. The silence of print matched the silence of households. Women received no encouragement to abandon practices that were harming them daily. The deeper truth was that cleanliness was never the goal. Appearances held more value. Preserving the whiteness of fabric mattered more than preventing illness. Women wrapped themselves in garments that looked proper, but smelled foul and carried parasites. Respectability was measured by colour, not by hygiene. The consequences were shared by everyone in the household. Husbands wore shirts dried in smoke and mould. Children wore dresses that carried fleas from the chicken coop. Families lived in clothing that gave them coughs, rashes, and infestations. Yet they accepted it all as ordinary. The story of laundry reveals another contradiction of daily life. Effort was poured into routines that destroyed health while preserving illusions. Women worked tirelessly, yet the outcome was filth, disguised as respectability. What should have brought cleanliness delivered the opposite. Garments stored in trunks and worn each day became silent carriers of disease. The very fabrics meant to shield the body instead exposed it to hidden threats. And while women folded clothes with pride, the wardrobes they filled began to harbour death alongside fabric. Clothes dried in darkness carried smoke, mould, and parasites. They kept up appearances but hid sickness. The silence around laundry left families vulnerable, trapped by superstition. The next layer of danger would reveal itself not in cloth, but in the wardrobes where death and filth found their permanent home. Shoes were prized possessions, often treated as symbols of status rather than tools for comfort. Women clung to their pairs of leather shoes through every season, no matter the condition of the soles or the state of their own feet. Inside these stiff and unyielding shells, sweat mixed with dirt, blood, and infection. The leather darkened from constant use, but instead of being replaced, the shoes were worn until they could barely hold together. What lay inside them was far worse than the cracked leather seen from the outside. Feet suffered endlessly within these shoes. Calluses formed on heels, blisters opened on toes, and nails turned black before falling off. Cuts and sores never healed properly because they were constantly pressed against hard leather. The dampness of sweat provided the perfect breeding ground for infection. Women walked through markets, churches, and gatherings with feet wrapped in silent pain. It is almost comical to imagine shoes polished for respectability while hiding feet swollen, bleeding, and infected inside. Blood often stained the inner soles, absorbed into the leather. Each step pressed the dried stains deeper, releasing odours of rot and sweat. Infection spread from one toe to the next, slowly turning entire feet into festering wounds. Yet these shoes were too valuable to discard. Families believed that ownership of leather footwear represented refinement, so women endured the suffering without complaint. The sharing of shoes between generations made matters worse. When one woman's shoes finally wore through, they were not thrown away. Instead, they were passed down to a younger relative or a servant girl. These second-hand shoes carried not only wear and tear but also the invisible residue of infection. Blisters, fungi, and blood from one woman were transferred directly onto the feet of another. To the poor, it was seen as a gift, but in truth, it was a transfer of disease. The smell inside these shoes was overpowering. Rotting leather mixed with human blood created an odour that lingered in homes. Women sprinkled powders inside to mask the stench, but these only formed crusts that added to the discomfort. Mould sprouted in damp corners, and insects sometimes nested within. To wear them was to step into filth every morning. The construction of shoes at the time added to the misery. Stiff leather pressed hard against skin, offering no flexibility. Insoles were often absent, leaving bare feet against rough seams. Stockings absorbed some of the damage, but they too carried sweat and blood after weeks of use without washing. Once pulled back on, the damp cloth reintroduced bacteria to open wounds. Shoes were not tailored for women's comfort. Fashion dictated narrow, tight designs that squeezed toes together unnaturally. Ingrown nails and joint deformities were common results. Despite the pain, shoes remained part of the display of femininity. Women endured limping, bleeding, and infection because appearing without shoes was a sign of poverty and shame. If we think about it today, it would be like wearing sneakers filled with broken glass and still smiling because fashion demanded it. The lack of medical knowledge meant that infections were ignored until they became catastrophic. Feet swelled, skin peeled, and sometimes entire toes blackened from untreated disease. Amputations were not unheard of, but the link between shoes and these conditions was rarely acknowledged. The shoes themselves were often kept even after the wearer was gone, passed on once more as if leather was more precious than life. Children also wore hand-me-down shoes far too large for their feet. Their toes curled and rubbed against stiff leather as they walked. Growth deformities started early, setting the stage for a lifetime of pain. Yet parents saw this as thriftiness, a way of ensuring every penny was stretched. The silent cost was carried in the feet of the young. Churches and social gatherings placed heavy importance on footwear. A woman might be judged by the condition of her shoes before her words were ever heard. This pressure reinforced the endless cycle of wearing shoes long past usability. Families could not risk the shame of appearing barefoot or in patched cloth shoes. Leather was worth more than health, and so women endured. Inside homes, shoes were rarely cleaned. Mud from streets hardened around soles, while the insides remained damp and stained. The smell of infection was masked by perfumes sprinkled onto feet before gatherings, but these scents only mixed with rot. Respectability once again meant silence in the face of filth. Shoemakers contributed little to improvement. Their goal was durability, not comfort. Hard leather guaranteed long use, even as it destroyed feet. The more rigid the design, the more it was praised for quality. Few considered the agony it caused. For the poor, second-hand shoes offered no relief. They inherited not just leather but the diseases of strangers. Diseases linked to shoes were rarely traced back to them. Ulcers, fevers, and even blood poisoning were common, but no one blamed footwear. Instead, weakness or divine punishment was assumed. This blindness allowed the cycle to continue unbroken, trapping generation after generation in the same misery. I cannot help but shudder at the thought of women walking with dignity, while each step pressed infected wounds deeper into rotting leather. The wardrobe of the Victorian woman was already dangerous, but shoes carried their own special horrors. They were symbols of refinement that masked suffering, items of pride that carried blood, rot, and disease. Families placed shoes above health, ensuring that the cycle of pain continued without end. Shoes became prisons for feet, sealed boxes of sweat, blood, and infection. Women stepped into them each day, believing they were preserving respectability, while in truth they were binding themselves to suffering. Even in death, shoes sometimes outlived their owners, passed down like treasures while carrying the hidden remains of decay. The story of these shoes is more than a detail of fashion. It is a portrait of how health was sacrificed for appearances. Women carried their agony silently, one step at a time, until their feet gave way. And when they did, the shoes continued on, ready to imprison another pair of feet. Shoes polished on the outside but rotting within reveal the cruel irony of Victorian respectability. They were symbols of refinement that carried disease in every seam. What came next was not about the feet, but the head, where even the hats women wore turned into nests of parasites and hidden filth. Hats were more than simple accessories. They were essential parts of a woman's appearance, signalling respectability, modesty, and social class. Every woman owned at least one, and wealthier households filled their closets with elaborate headpieces decorated with ribbons, feathers, or lace. But beneath these ornaments lay a disturbing reality. Hats, lined with wool and rarely cleaned, provided the perfect home for vermin. Rodents and insects thrived inside these dark, damp spaces. Women wore them with pride, never realizing they were placing nests of filth directly on their heads. The linings of hats absorbed sweat and oils from the scalp. Combined with the dampness of rain or snow, they created conditions where lice multiplied rapidly. Women carried these parasites with them into churches, theatres, and dances. Lice bites left red sores across scalps, often oozing with infection. Scratching only spread the irritation further, yet women had little choice but to keep wearing the same hats. Removing them in public was unthinkable, as it meant revealing hair already dirtied by oil, sweat, and parasites. The irony is almost unbearable. Hats meant to crown respectability often crowned filth instead. Rodents found their way into hats as well. Stories circulated of mice nesting in hats stored on shelves, hidden between layers of felt and wool. Some women placed their hats on their heads without checking, only to feel scratching and movement above their scalp. These tales were whispered in horror, but they did not stop the practice of wearing and re-wearing the same pieces for years. Hats, after all, were expensive. Throwing one away was not an option, even if it had once served as a rat's nest. Fleas and bedbugs also flourished in hat linings. Women attending grand balls sometimes felt the sudden sting of bites during dances. A smile covered their pain, but beneath their hairline, small streams of blood trickled from fresh wounds. To admit such a thing would have been a humiliation greater than the pain itself. Silence kept the problem hidden, even as infestation spread from hat to home. The materials used in hats contributed to the nightmare. Felt, wool, and velvet were porous, absorbing everything from sweat to smoke. Without proper cleaning methods, these materials held onto filth for years. Perfume sachets were tucked inside hats to mask odours, but they only layered sweetness over rot. Beneath the faint smell of roses or lavender lay mildew, rodent droppings, and stale sweat. Glue used in hat making was another source of horror. Made from boiled animal bones, hooves, and even decomposed remains, it carried a permanent stench. In warm weather, the glue softened and released foul odours, clinging to the wearer's hair. Women at social gatherings might be praised for their elegance, even as the smell of rot seeped into the air around them. If we imagine the same today, it would be like walking into a ballroom with a trash bin strapped to your head and pretending it was glamorous. The heat of crowded rooms worsened the problem. Sweat ran down from scalps, soaking hat linings already filled with lice and fleas. As women danced, Parasites shifted and multiplied. By the end of the evening, bites covered their necks and scalps, yet no one spoke of it. Hats remained on heads, no matter the discomfort, because respectability demanded endurance. Children's hats were just as contaminated. Passed down through families or shared among siblings, they carried lice from one child to the next. Mothers powdered the insides with starch or chalk, hoping to dry out infestations, but this only created crusty layers that irritated skin further. Children went to bed itching, their small heads covered in sores, but no solution was ever found. Hat shops offered little relief. Try-on samples passed from head to head without cleaning. Each customer left behind sweat and lice, which the next unknowingly carried home. The business of hats relied on appearance, not hygiene. So long as the hat looked fine on the outside, no one asked about the filth embedded within. Doctors of the time treated sores and scalp infections with ointments, but they rarely considered hats as the cause. Women were told to keep their heads covered for modesty, and so the cycle repeated. The parasites never disappeared. The glue continued to stink. The linings grew darker with sweat and mould, yet hats remained symbols of grace. The contradiction was clear. Women could step into a grand hall wearing gowns that cost more than a servant's annual wages, while lice crawled in and out of the seams of their hats. Appearances were everything, even if they meant enduring parasites and rot in silence. I find it disturbing to think of women lifting their heads with pride, knowing that inside their hats were nests of vermin pressing against their scalps. Over time, hats deteriorated, but instead of being discarded, they were repaired. New ribbons and feathers were added, disguising the decay beneath. Families considered this thrift, but it only extended the life of infestations. Parasites thrived as hats passed through years and generations, feeding on every new scalp that wore them. The story of hats reveals how deeply respectability was tied to appearances. Women accepted pain, parasites, and filth, because to go without a hat was to invite shame. Insects and rodents were silent companions, hidden beneath lace and feathers, but tolerated for the sake of social standing. Hats, admired as symbols of refinement, concealed filth and suffering. They rested on women's heads not as ornaments but as cages of vermin. Each bow and feather decorated a hidden nest of lice, fleas, and sometimes rodents. Yet still the hats remained, because appearances mattered more than truth. Parasites biting scalps, glue stinking of rot, and linings soaked in sweat. All were accepted without question. This was the price of respectability, carried silently on the heads of women who believed they were showing their best selves. Hats were supposed to be crowns of elegance, but in truth, they were masks of decay. Women walked proudly through streets and ballrooms, carrying vermin above their faces, disguised by feathers and silk. The silence of this suffering reveals how deeply appearances ruled over health. Hats carried death and filth as surely as any wardrobe or shoe. They framed faces and completed outfits, but beneath them lived creatures waiting to feed. The next source of hidden danger, however, would not rest on women's heads but would seep directly into their skin, disguised as beauty treatments that promised elegance while delivering poison. Cosmetics and clothing were meant to enhance beauty and display refinement. To Victorian women, they were as essential as food or shelter. But behind the powders, perfumes, and layers of fabric lay a slow process of decay. Each application of paint or lotion pushed toxins deeper into the skin. Every layer of fabric trapped sweat and disease. Women who prided themselves on cleanliness and elegance were, in truth, silently poisoning themselves. Face powders were among the most dangerous products. Many were made with arsenic, lead, and mercury. These powders created a pale, flawless look that society valued as purity. The whiteness of skin was not only fashionable but also tied to class. As pale faces suggested a life away from physical labour, women spread the powder generously, ignoring the rashes, sores, and burns that developed over time. Some powders even caused hair loss and tooth decay, yet the pale mask remained a standard of beauty. It is grimly ironic to think that women painted their faces with poison to look alive while their bodies grew weaker each day. Perfume was another tool of deception. Rather than being distilled from safe flowers, many perfumes were made with chemicals that irritated the skin and lungs. Women dabbed these scents on their necks, wrists, and clothing to disguise the odours of unwashed bodies and mouldy garments. The fragrance lingered in rooms, covering the stench of rot. But behind the sweet smells were lungs filling with toxins and skin covered in red patches. Doctors often noted strange respiratory illnesses among women who wore perfumes daily, but few connected the dots. Clothing contributed to the process of self-destruction. Fabrics were rarely cleaned properly, and dyes often contained toxic metals. Dresses soaked up sweat and blood, then released these into the skin as they were worn again and again. Corsets rubbed against sores, pressing bacteria into wounds. Lace and velvet trapped dust and mould. What looked glamorous on the outside was filth pressed tightly against flesh. Lotions and creams were no safer. Advertisements promised youth and vitality, but many of these mixtures contained strong acids or animal fats gone rancid. Women rubbed them into their faces, hands, and arms, believing they were nourishing their skin. Instead, the lotions burned and scarred. Some left skin raw and bleeding. Still, women bought more, convinced that beauty came from endurance. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like applying cleaning chemicals to your face every morning and calling it skincare. The culture of silence made everything worse. Women were taught not to speak of discomfort, sores, or strange smells. Complaining about beauty products was seen as a weakness, or even as a lack of morality. Pain was expected. Sacrificing health for beauty was seen as a virtue. Even when women collapsed from illness, they continued to apply powders and creams, carried forward by the weight of expectation. Servants witnessed the truth more than anyone. They washed garments stained with sweat, blood, and lotion. They saw powders crumble into sores on their mistresses' faces, yet their voices carried no weight. They endured the smells and stains in silence, while their mistresses walked out in public, appearing radiant. Respectability was a lie maintained by suffering. Reports of women dying from cosmetic use appeared occasionally in newspapers. Death certificates sometimes listed exhaustion or weakness, but those close to the victims knew it was the nightly application of powders or the daily rubbing of creams that brought decline. A few doctors spoke openly, warning against the use of arsenic and lead. Their warnings were drowned out by demand. Women wanted to believe that beauty was worth the risk. The contradiction was sharp. A society that valued morality and order encouraged women to smear their faces with poison and wrap themselves in infested cloth. The empire claimed cleanliness and refinement, yet its women died slowly from practices called beauty. I find it deeply unsettling to picture women looking in mirrors with pride while sores spread beneath the powder they had just applied. This cycle of self-destruction was fueled by poverty as well as pride. Poor women could not afford safer products, even if they had been available. They purchased the cheapest powders, often the most toxic, and applied them heavily to cover the grime of daily labour. For them, beauty was survival, a way to appear respectable despite hardship. Their suffering was invisible because it was expected. Children also felt the impact. Mothers applied powders to their daughters, teaching them that pale faces were more important than health. Girls grew up with poisoned skin before they understood what it meant. Entire generations inherited not just clothing and customs, but the slow poisoning of their bodies. Hygiene rituals were woven into daily life without question. Women opened wardrobes filled with mouldy garments, dabbed perfumes on their necks, and pressed powders into their faces before stepping into the streets. Each action was a step deeper into illness, but each was considered necessary. To appear without them was to risk ridicule and shame. The slow destruction of bodies through beauty rituals reveals how powerful social expectations were. Women believed they were improving themselves, but every gesture shortened their lives. Their beauty was a mask of decay, admired in public while hiding sores, sickness, and weakness in private. By the end of many lives, skin was scarred, teeth were blackened, and hair had fallen out. Yet the illusion of beauty was maintained until death. Bodies placed in coffins were often powdered one final time, painted in whiteness even as decay set in. The lie of refinement was carried into the grave. Cosmetics and clothing created a surface of elegance but a buried truth. Underneath each gown and behind each powdered face was illness growing unchecked. The silence that surrounded this decay made it even more dangerous. Beauty was not freedom but a trap, built by society and endured by women without question. Women lived and died beneath masks of poison, convinced they were honouring dignity. Their bodies carried the scars of lotions, powders, perfumes, and filthy fabrics, all in the name of respectability. Each gesture that appeared to lift them higher only dragged them further down. The story of beauty in this time is one of contradiction. It was a mask that concealed decay, a set of rituals that led to sickness and death. Women carried the empire's image of refinement, but their flesh told another story, one of silent destruction. They stepped into society with powdered faces and perfumed gowns, hiding the sickness growing inside them. Beauty appeared to crown them with grace, but beneath it lay a body rotting slowly. The next layer of horror would be found not in cosmetics or clothing, but in the very air of their homes, where poisons and filth drifted quietly and settled on every surface. Underwear was supposed to be the layer closest to the body, offering some degree of softness and modesty. In practice, it was often the opposite. Many women wore pieces made from recycled wool taken from horse blankets, old saddles, or stable coverings. These fabrics carried the marks of their former use. They were coarse to the touch, heavy with odours, and sometimes still held fragments of hair or insects. Women pulled these garments onto their bodies each day, telling themselves they were fulfilling the duty of decency, but they were really pressing filth directly against their skin. The stench was overwhelming. Wool that had absorbed horse sweat and manure retained those smells no matter how many times it was rinsed. Heat from the body released the odours again, filling homes and markets with faint but constant traces of stables. Women carried this smell with them into every social space. It clung to their skirts and spread across their bodies. It is almost absurd to imagine women being praised for refinement, while their most intimate clothing still smelled of horses and dung. Summer made the suffering worse. Coarse wool trapped heat and moisture in the most sensitive parts of the body. Skin quickly became raw, itchy, and blistered. Rashes spread across thighs and hips, and sores opened where the fabric rubbed hardest. Some women lost patches of skin from the constant irritation, yet they continued to wear the same garments. Underwear was not seen as something to change frequently. It was expected to last for years. Parasites thrived in these conditions. Lice and fleas nestled into the folds of fabric, feeding on the warmth and dampness. Women scratched themselves raw in private but remained silent in public. Doctors who examined patients often found infestations that began in the undergarments and spread outward. Infection was common, but the connection to clothing was rarely discussed. The fabric itself carried dangers. Wool from horse blankets was thick with dirt and grit that scratched skin like sandpaper. Women layered skirts and dresses over it, which only pressed the roughness deeper into the flesh. Tiny cuts from the abrasive fabric became entry points for bacteria. Over time, these wounds developed into ulcers that refused to heal. Poverty made this practice nearly universal among working families. Purchasing new fabric for underwear was seen as wasteful. Every scrap had to be reused, and horse blankets provided large pieces of material. Mothers stitched them into undergarments for daughters, continuing the cycle of irritation and disease. For many families, the choice was not between safe and unsafe fabric, but between having undergarments or none at all. Even among wealthier households, servants often wore such garments. Mistresses passed down old pieces once they became too rough or stained for personal use. Servants had no choice but to wear them. This ensured that infestations and rashes spread across all classes, though silence kept the shame hidden. Attempts to improve comfort were limited and ineffective. Some women dusted the inside of their garments with powders made from starch or chalk. These absorbed sweat for a time but quickly clumped into hard crusts that rubbed skin even worse. Others tried adding perfume, but the fragrance only mixed with the odours of manure and sweat, creating a sickly smell. If we think about this today, it would be like cutting up a filthy horse blanket, sewing it into underwear, and believing it was an acceptable substitute for clothing. The psychological toll was heavy. Women endured constant discomfort, itching, and shame. Yet they convinced themselves it was part of proper womanhood. Speaking of such things was considered indecent. Silence ruled over households, leaving women to suffer privately. Husbands and children smelled the filth but said nothing. Respectability mattered more than comfort or health. Medical consequences followed quickly. Sores that began as rashes developed into chronic infections. Some women lost fertility from repeated irritation and scarring. Doctors sometimes recorded cases of inflammation of the womb, without understanding that the cause was the daily contact of filthy fabric against the skin. These silent injuries added to the already short and painful lives of many women. Laundry practices did not help. Garments were rinsed in cold water, rarely boiled, and almost never exposed to direct sunlight. Parasites survived the wash. Odours remained. Women pulled the same underwear back onto their bodies, now damp and stiff, believing they had done their duty. The reality was that nothing had changed. Children faced the same conditions. Young girls were given miniature versions of the same undergarments, stitched from scraps. Their delicate skin suffered even more quickly. Rashes became infections, and discomfort became normal before they were old enough to question it. Generations inherited not only fabric but also the pain and shame attached to it. The cycle of using horse blankets for underwear illustrates how poverty and respectability collided. Families were trapped between the need to appear proper and the lack of resources to secure safe materials. The body paid the price. Flesh broke down under the weight of coarse fabric, while silence ensured the suffering continued. I cannot help but feel disturbed at the thought of women stitching together old stable cloth, knowing exactly what it smelled of, and still placing it against their most vulnerable skin. Society's obsession with appearance played its part as well. Undergarments were rarely seen in public, but their very existence symbolized modesty. To be without them was to invite shame. This pressure forced women to endure filth rather than abandon the garment altogether. The illusion of morality mattered more than the reality of health. Over time, the wool fibres broke down further, releasing even more dirt and pests. Pieces were patched and repatched, never truly discarded. Some women wore the same undergarments for decades, their bodies scarred from constant contact. The garments decayed along with the flesh that wore them. The truth was simple but devastating. What was supposed to protect and cover the body instead destroyed it slowly. Underwear became a silent weapon, cutting and infecting skin with every step and movement. Women endured it because society demanded silence, and poverty left them no choice. Garments made from horse blankets carried filth, parasites, and disease into homes. They rubbed sores into flesh, spread infestations, and poisoned generations. Families accepted them as ordinary, but they were instruments of decay disguised as clothing. Women lived and died with coarse fabric pressed against their skin, believing it was modesty, while it was really slow destruction. The next horror, however, would not lie hidden beneath skirts but would shine openly from women's ears. where jewellery itself became another source of pain and infection. Jewellery was considered a marker of refinement and femininity. Earrings especially carried symbolic meaning, often passed down from mothers to daughters as treasured heirlooms. But these ornaments, admired for their sparkle, hid dangers that most women never spoke of. Earrings were shared among relatives, friends, or neighbours without ever being cleaned. This act of trust, intended to display beauty, carried infection directly from one ear to another. Flesh and metal met in silence, leaving behind wounds that festered unseen beneath hair and hats. The holes pierced into the ears were already vulnerable. Hygiene was poor, and wounds from piercing rarely healed properly. Dirt, sweat, and oils collected around the openings, forming crust that trapped bacteria. When a new earring was pushed through, it forced germs deeper into the skin. What began as mild redness soon became swelling, throbbing pain, and discharge. Women endured the discomfort, believing it was the natural cost of adornment. It is almost ridiculous to think that women polished earrings to shine while ignoring the pus leaking from their own ears. The infections could become severe. Pus built up until it burst, releasing foul smells. Skin around the ears hardened and darkened. Some women developed fevers as bacteria spread into their bloodstream. Yet these symptoms were hidden beneath hair carefully arranged or hats pulled low. To admit an ear infection would have been shameful, suggesting a lack of cleanliness or weakness. So the silence continued. The materials used in earrings only worsened the problem. Many were made from cheap alloys that contained lead or other toxic metals. These corroded with sweat, leaving green or black stains on the skin. Over time, constant exposure to such metals caused discoloration, rashes, and even neurological problems. Wealthier families with gold or silver earrings fared somewhat better, but even these were not free of risk. Without cleaning, even the most expensive metals carried bacteria from one ear to another. Women often wore earrings continuously, never removing them even at night. This meant wounds never had a chance to dry or heal. Moisture and dirt remained trapped around the pierced holes. The skin broke down further, and new layers of infection began. Some women developed thick scar tissue that distorted the shape of their ears, but these changes were hidden beneath hair, never spoken of, and rarely acknowledged in polite society. Sharing jewellery was a common practice. A cousin might borrow earrings for a wedding, a neighbour for a church service. The act was seen as generosity, but in reality, it spread infection from household to household. Each new wearer pushed the same contaminated metal through their flesh, carrying bacteria with it. Infections travelled silently through communities, leaving women with swollen ears and scarred tissue. Attempts at cleaning were minimal. Some women wiped their earrings with cloths already dirty from other chores. Others dipped them briefly in water, believing this to be enough. True sterilization was unknown. The germs remained, invisible but deadly. Families passed earrings down as symbols of continuity, never realizing they also passed down infections that scarred bodies for generations. Doctors occasionally treated severe ear infections, but they often dismissed them as minor. Women were given ointments that soothed the skin but did not address the root cause. Once symptoms subsided, earrings were reinserted, and the cycle began again. Medicine of the time was ill-equipped to confront the hidden dangers of everyday adornments. The pain was constant but normalized. Women expected tenderness and swelling around their ears. Some accepted the throbbing as part of beauty. Jewellery was tied to dignity and respectability, so removing it was rarely considered an option. A woman without earrings might be seen as poor or careless. The illusion of elegance mattered more than the reality of health. Children suffered as well. Girls were often pierced at a young age and immediately given earrings made from the same recycled metals. Their tender skin swelled quickly, leaving them crying in pain. Mothers reassured themselves that the suffering was necessary, part of growing into womanhood. Infections that left scars were simply endured, hidden under long hair as the girls grew older. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like handing down toothbrushes from one person to another and calling it a family tradition. The symbolism of earrings added to the silence. They represented family ties, femininity, and continuity. To speak against them was to challenge cultural values. So even when infections grew severe, women continued to wear and share them. Their dignity was displayed through ornaments that quietly destroyed their health. The appearance of beauty in public masked private misery. At social events, women smiled and turned their heads with grace, while under their hair, pus dripped and sores throbbed. No one mentioned it. No one dared to ask. The elegance of the surface was preserved at any cost. I find it unsettling to imagine women carefully adjusting earrings in mirrors, ignoring the dark stains and swollen flesh that told the truth. This contradiction captured the essence of daily life. What society praised as refinement often brought decay. Jewellery, like powders, perfumes, and garments, was another mask of respectability that hid the cost in flesh and blood. The pain of infected ears was part of a larger cycle in which beauty was purchased with suffering. Over the years, scars thickened and ears became misshapen. Some women lost sensation in parts of their ears, while others had permanent discoloration. Yet earrings remained a part of their daily attire until death. Coffins sometimes contained bodies still adorned with earrings, the ornaments shining while the ears beneath them were marked by years of infection and scarring. Earrings were meant to symbolize beauty, but they carried hidden poison. They spread infection silently, scarring bodies while preserving appearances. The women who wore them carried pain beneath their smiles, another reminder of how refinement was built on silent suffering. Ornaments meant to elevate beauty became tools of destruction. The glitter of earrings distracted from the pus and scars they caused, and as women continued to wear them proudly, the truth remained hidden beneath ribbons, hair, and silence. Earrings that sparkled in candlelight also carried disease in their metal. Women endured the pain to maintain dignity, never speaking of the sores. What would come after earrings would take the obsession with appearance further, as women turned to harsh treatments that stripped their skin in the pursuit of purity. Earrings were rarely removed once they were put in place. For many women, they became permanent fixtures, staying in their ears through sleep, bathing, and sickness. What began as an adornment turned into a breeding ground for disease. Skin that should have healed after piercing was kept open by constant friction and pressure. Bacteria crept into the wounds and multiplied, unseen beneath strands of hair or the edges of a bonnet. Over time, the infections deepened, bringing with them smells, pus, and in the most horrific cases, infestations that went far beyond ordinary sores. Doctors occasionally recorded shocking discoveries. In one case, a woman suffering from persistent headaches was examined, and to everyone's horror, living worms were pulled from her ear canal. These had developed because earrings had never been removed, allowing dirt and rot to accumulate for years. The stench of necrosis was so strong that servants fainted when they leaned too close. Such examples were rare but not unheard of, and they cast a grim light on the silent suffering endured in the name of beauty. It is almost beyond belief that jewellery meant to sparkle in candlelight could instead become a doorway for worms crawling into flesh. The silence of women worsened these conditions. They were taught that complaining was a sign of weakness, and that discomfort was simply part of femininity. Even when pain became unbearable, many endured it without speaking. Servants who noticed swelling, foul smells, or discharges dared not raise their voices. Respectability demanded that everything appear normal, even as ears rotted slowly beneath hair and hats. Infestations of this kind developed over time, beginning with untreated infections. Earrings passed from one generation to another were already coated with bacteria. When inserted into fresh piercings or already sore ears, they pushed filth deeper. Women who never removed the jewellery allowed pus and blood to harden around the posts, locking the earrings in place. The skin became swollen and thick, trapping dirt and insects within. The conditions of Victorian homes encouraged these horrors. Houses were filled with pests, from flies buzzing in kitchens to fleas jumping from wardrobes. Flies laid eggs in any moist and infected tissue they found. When they encountered swollen and leaking, they deposited larvae. Without cleaning or removal of jewellery, the larvae hatched into worms, burrowing into flesh. The pain was excruciating, but silence kept it hidden. The smell of infected ears was difficult to disguise. Perfume could not mask the odour of rotting flesh. In crowded parlours and ballrooms, the faint stench clung to women's heads, though it was never openly acknowledged. Polite society pretended not to notice, preferring the illusion of refinement to the reality of decay. If we compare this to today, it would be like seeing worms crawl from someone's AirPods and still choosing to compliment their outfit. The fear of exposure kept many women isolated. When infections worsened, they stayed home rather than risk discovery. Hats and hairstyles became tools of concealment